The sun out in the high desert doesn't just shine, it punishes. It poured down on a young woman who was trying to become one with the broken trunk of a dead palm tree. She had nothing but a handful of wide, sharp leaves to cover herself. Her skin was a map of her last few hours, glistening with sweat and blood and dust. Her name was Clara Dawson. She was only 25, but in the harsh light of that desert afternoon, she looked like life had already chewed her up and spit her out. She pulled the leaves tighter, her knees tucked to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. Her long hair was a wild curtain across her face. Every inch of her screamed. Bruises bloomed like dark flowers on her shoulders. Angry red scratches crisscrossed her legs, and a deep, ugly wound at her side was weeping blood into the thirsty earth, a slow and steady rhythm of pain. This wasn't the first time. Not by a long shot. Her husband, John, had a talent for breaking things. Day by day, he'd chipped away at her spirit. His jealousy was a living thing, a monster that lived in their house and fed on his suspicions. If she so much as looked at another man, he saw betrayal. And every time he saw betrayal, his fists got harder. Every time she prayed for a mercy that never came. This morning, the monster had gotten too hungry. The violence became something she knew deep in her bones that she would not survive. So she took her one chance. She fled. She ran from the house out into the open wild, barefoot, half-clothed, a desperate animal escaping the trap. She sprinted until her lungs were on fire, and every step was a fresh agony on the soles of her feet. The sun was a white-hot poker in her eyes, but the idea of freedom, that one beautiful word, was worth it. All she wanted was to survive. She thought she'd done it. She thought she'd finally outrun the monster. But fate, you see, is a cruel storyteller. It always has one more chapter. A lone cowboy on a tall horse stepped right into her path. It wasn't John, but the look in his eyes, that was the same. Clara begged him. Her voice was a cracked whisper. Her body was a leaf shaking in the wind. She begged him to just let her go. He didn't. The empty land was quiet, except for the sounds of a struggle that didn't last long. Clara fought. She pushed and she kicked, but her strength was a distant memory. He forced her down into the dry, yellow grass. A scream tore from her throat and was swallowed by the vast, empty prairie. No one heard it. No one came. The sun just kept blazing, and as the horror ended, the cowboy climbed back on his horse and rode away without a single word. He left her there, broken, bleeding. She dragged her body to the dead palm tree. That's where she was now, clutching the leaves like a shield, her skin burning, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her mind was a whirlpool of shame and terror. She wished the earth would just open up and swallow her whole. Every man she'd met out here was a monster. Her husband, the stranger. Both had turned her life into a waking nightmare. She curled tighter, tears making clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks before drying up. Her lips moved, but she wasn't praying for rescue anymore. She was praying for an ending. The desert stretched on forever around her. The day dragged its feet, and then, through the hot, heavy silence, came a sound. Hoofbeats. Slow, steady, coming closer. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the palm leaves so tight their edges dug into her skin. Was it the cowboy? Had he come back? Or worse, had John found her? A shadow fell over her. It was long and cool. She risked a look, slowly lifting her head. A man was climbing down from his horse. He was older. His face was weathered, carved by sun and time, and his eyes held a sorrow she recognized, but underneath it, there was a strength that was entirely new. He took a slow step closer. The sun lit up his face and Clara could barely breathe. Was this just another beast in this God-forsaken land? Or was he something else entirely? Samuel Carter didn't rush. He stood there for a long moment, letting the terrified woman see his hands. Both of them were empty. Both of them were steady. He'd seen that look before, on wounded animals and on people who had been hurt so bad they were one step away from shattering completely. Clara stared up at him, her eyes wide and wet, her body trembling. She was coiled like a spring, ready to scream, ready to crawl, ready for the next nightmare to begin. But Samuel just kept his voice low and gentle, as soft as the evening breeze. "You're safe now," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. "No one is going to touch you again. I promise." Something in his tone, the simple, solid way he said it, made her stop trembling. Just for a second. It wasn't pity. It was truth. He moved slowly, deliberately, and slipped the worn denim shirt off his back. It was faded by the sun and torn at the cuffs, but it was strong. He knelt beside her, his knees cracking in the silence, and gently draped it across her shaking shoulders. Clara grabbed it, pulling it tight around herself, hiding the bruises, hiding the shame. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she didn't feel so naked under the cruel eye of the sun. Her lips parted, but no words came out, only a sob, a tiny, broken sound. Samuel didn't press her. He helped her to her feet, so careful you'd think she was made of glass. She leaned on him, weak and shaky, as he guided her to his horse. His ranch wasn't far. It was a lonely little spread tucked away from the main road, the kind of quiet place that trouble usually passed by. Once they were inside the small, sturdy ranch house, the words finally came. They didn't just come. They poured out of her in a flood. She told him everything. She told him about John, about his jealous rages that would come out of nowhere, about how every glance at another man was a crime punishable by his fists. She told him how she learned to fear the sound of his boots on the floorboards at night. She told him she ran this morning because she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if she had stayed one more day, he would have killed her. Samuel listened. He just listened, his face calm, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't judge. He didn't interrupt. He poured her a cup of cool water from the well, placed a thick slice of bread on the table in front of her, and sat close enough so she wouldn't feel so alone in the vast emptiness. When she finally broke down, her story finished. He just let her cry. When she grew quiet, he waited. Then Clara looked at him, her eyes still swimming with fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please don't send me back. If I go back to him, he will destroy me." Samuel leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He rubbed the gray stubble on his chin, his gaze distant. He'd seen men like John Dawson before, men who wore their jealousy like a badge of honor, men who believed a wife was just another piece of property, like a horse or a parcel of land. And men like that, they never ever stop. Not until someone makes them. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of an old wall clock. Clara sat across from him, clutching his shirt, her entire future hanging on the words of this quiet stranger. Would he shelter her, knowing the storm that would surely follow? Or would he send her back to the man who had already broken her once and would not fail to finish the job the second time? The next morning, the ranch felt almost peaceful. Clara sat on the porch, wrapped in Samuel's shirt, watching the sun paint the hills in shades of orange and pink. For a fleeting moment, she let herself believe the nightmare was over. But peace is a fragile thing in the Wild West. The sound of hoofbeats, fast and angry, shattered the morning calm. A plume of dust rose in the distance. Samuel stepped out of the house, his jaw set like stone. He knew who it was before the rider even cleared the rise. John Dawson. He reined his horse in so hard it reared back, its eyes wild. John's own eyes burned with a furious fire. His voice was a whip crack across the quiet yard. "Clara, get over here, you're coming home!" Clara froze. The shirt felt like it was suffocating her. She shook her head, a tiny, silent gesture of defiance. "No," she whispered to the empty air. But John was already off his horse, his boots stomping up the wooden steps of the porch. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging in like claws. She cried out, a sharp yelp of pain and fear. "You think you can run from me?" he snarled, his face just inches from hers. "You think you can hide with this washed-up old rancher? Everyone will know what kind of woman you are." Before John could drag her another inch, Samuel was there. His hand, weathered and strong, clamped down on John's wrist. He twisted, a short, sharp movement that made the younger man cry out and loosen his grip. Samuel's voice was quiet, but it was harder than stone. "That is enough. You will not touch her again." John, furious, tried to shove him back, but pushing Samuel was like pushing an old oak tree. At 56, his body was a testament to decades of hard work, and it held a strength that John's rage-fueled frenzy couldn't match. In one smooth, powerful motion, Samuel spun him around and threw him off the porch. John landed in the dirt with a grunt. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The man who had terrorized her for years was now sprawled in the dust at her feet. John's face was a mask of red, not just from the fall, but from the raw, burning humiliation. He scrambled to his feet, spat a glob of dirt and saliva onto the ground, and pointed a trembling finger at Samuel. "You will regret this," he seethed. "Both of you will." He hauled himself back onto his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred hanging in the air. The ranch was quiet again, but the peace was gone. The air was thick with unspoken threats. Samuel turned to Clara, his eyes steady, but she could see the trouble in them. He knew this wasn't the end. John wasn't the kind of man who just let things go. There would be consequences. There would be a price to pay. Clara buried her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with a fresh wave of terror. Samuel placed a firm hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a silent promise that she was not alone. A couple of days passed in a tense, fragile quiet. Clara tried to make herself useful, sweeping the porch, feeding the handful of chickens Samuel kept, anything to keep her hands and her mind busy. Samuel watched her, saw a little bit of color return to her cheeks, and he almost let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, John had given up. But in a small town, a bad reputation travels faster than a prairie fire. John didn't come back to the ranch with his fists swinging. He did something much smarter and much crueler. He went into town and opened his mouth. By sundown, the whispers had started in the saloon. Clara Dawson had run off to warm another man's bed. By the next morning, the blacksmith was telling it as if he'd seen it with his own two eyes. By noon, even the preacher's wife was shaking her head in prim disapproval. It wasn't just gossip. It was poison. John spun a tale of a cheating wife and a heartbroken husband. He shouted in the streets that Clara had shamed his good name, that she'd run off with that reclusive old rancher, Samuel Carter. Some men laughed and clapped him on the back. Others spit in the dust as they heard the story. A few just nodded grimly, as if it was exactly what they expected from a woman. But then he added a threat, and that's when the poison really started to work. He swore that if the town had any sense of honor, they'd see to it that Clara was punished for her betrayal, publicly. When Samuel rode into town for supplies, he could feel it. The stares were like daggers in his back. Men he'd known for 20 years suddenly found something interesting to look at on the other side of the street. A couple of drifters muttered something ugly as he passed. One of them even spat on the ground near his boot. Samuel kept his head held high, but a cold fury was burning in his gut. Not for himself. He didn't give a damn what they thought of him, but for Clara. She had suffered more than any 10 people should have to, and now this town was painting her as the villain. He rode back to the ranch with a heavy heart. Clara felt the chill, too, A neighbor woman who had always been friendly came by with a basket of eggs. She set them on the porch, turned around, and left without saying a single word. Clara stood there holding the basket, feeling smaller and more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Samuel, her voice cracking. "Will I ever be free of him?" Samuel put a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "You are not alone in this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We will find a way to end it." That night, as the lantern light cast long shadows on the walls, Samuel saddled his horse. He told Clara there was only one person left who might be able to cut through the lies: Sheriff Miller. He was known as a fair man, if a little slow to act. If they could just get to him, lay out the truth before him, maybe, just maybe, the law would finally be on their side. The ride into town under the cold moonlight was heavy with dread. Clara sat behind Samuel, clutching his shirt, her knuckles white. With every hoofbeat, she sent up a silent prayer, a prayer that this would be the answer, a prayer that justice could be stronger than a lie. But as they neared the sheriff's office, their hearts sank. There was a crowd gathered outside. Torches flickered, casting a hellish glow on a sea of angry faces. Voices were rising, a low, ugly rumble that was growing into a roar. One question burned in both their minds. Would the sheriff stand with them, or had the town already decided that Clara Dawson was guilty? Sheriff Miller stepped out onto the porch of his office. The crowd surged forward, their voices rising like a gathering storm. "Adulteress!" one man shouted. "Punish her!" screamed a woman from the back. John Dawson stood near the front, a smug, satisfied look on his face. Samuel stood his ground, with Clara clutching his arm, her body trembling. They were an island in a sea of hate. Miller held up a hand, and the crowd quieted just enough for his voice to carry. "I have known Samuel Carter for most of my life," he said, his voice loud and clear. "He is not a man who steals another man's wife." He turned his gaze on Clara, and his voice softened just a fraction. "And I have seen Clara Dawson tonight. She does not look like a woman of betrayal. She looks like a woman covered in scars." A nervous whisper went through the crowd. This wasn't what they were expecting. Samuel stepped forward, his voice plain and strong, ringing with conviction. "John is the one who put those scars there," he declared, pointing a finger at Dawson. "He is the one who beats and torments her. Is this the kind of man you want to stand with?" For the first time, Clara lifted her head high. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the night air like a knife. "I never betrayed him," she said, her words clear and unwavering. "I only tried to survive." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Even the angriest voices in the crowd seemed to falter. They looked from John's furious face to Clara's bruised but defiant one, and for the first time doubt began to creep into their minds. But just as it seemed the tide might be turning, a new voice cut through the quiet. It was a man near the back, a drifter Samuel recognized from the saloon. "That's her word against his. A husband's got a right to discipline his wife." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The doubt was fading, replaced by the old, ugly certainty. John seized the moment. "She's a liar!" he roared. "She shamed me! She ran off with him! They should both be punished!" The crowd roared its approval. The sea of hate was turning into a wave, ready to crash down on them. Sheriff Miller looked from the mob to Samuel and Clara. He was one man against a town full of fury. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol. It was clear that his words alone were not going to be enough. Justice in this town wasn't going to be decided by a speech. It was going to be decided by blood. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Not from the sheriff, not from Samuel. It came from the edge of the crowd. Everyone froze, turning to see who had fired. An old man stood there, a smoking pistol in his hand, pointed at the sky. It was Jebediah, the town's blacksmith. "Hold on now," he growled, his voice like grinding metal. I've known John Dawson since he was a boy, and I've seen the way he drinks. I've seen the rage in his eyes. I ain't saying she's a saint, but I'm saying he ain't one either." Another man stepped forward, the owner of the general store. "And I've seen Clara come into my store for a year, always with her eyes downcast, always with a fresh bruise she tried to hide with her hair. We all saw it. We just chose not to." It was like a dam had broken. One by one, other voices joined in. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough to show that John's poison hadn't infected the entire town. Enough to give the sheriff the support he needed. Sheriff Miller nodded once, his eyes hard. "Deputies," he called out, and two men stepped forward from the crowd, revealing the badges pinned to their shirts. "Bring me John Dawson." The law had finally, decisively, turned. John's face went from smug triumph to pale terror in a heartbeat. He tried to run, but the crowd that had been his army a moment before now blocked his path. They seized him, and the truth, at last, had weight. John Dawson was dragged away in chains, his shouts of denial and threats fading into the night as the crowd slowly, quietly began to break apart. Clara leaned against Samuel, the tension finally leaving her body. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of release. But as the deputies hauled John towards the jail, he twisted his head back and locked eyes with Samuel. There was no fear in his eyes now, only pure reptilian hatred. "This isn't over, old man," he screamed. "My family built this town. You think a tin star and a few cowards can stop us? You've just signed your own death warrant." His words hung in the chilly night air, a promise that was far more terrifying than the anger of the mob. The immediate danger was over, but Samuel knew, with a cold certainty deep in his bones, that the real war had just begun. He had won the battle, but the Dawson family was not just one man. It was a legacy of darkness, and it would not be defeated so easily. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. Clara helped Samuel mend a fence, the simple rhythmic work a balm for her frayed nerves. The sun was warm, the air was clear, and for the first time since she could remember, she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder. She even laughed, a soft, rusty sound, at a small joke Samuel made. Her smile wasn't shadowed by fear anymore. It was a start. But John's threat echoed in Samuel's mind. The Dawson family. He remembered whispers from years ago, stories about John's father, Jedediah Dawson, a man who had ruled the county with an iron fist and a crooked ledger, a man who had a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter who he had to crush to get it. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel decided it was time. He couldn't protect Clara if she didn't know the whole truth. He told her about his own past, how 20 years ago he'd had a wife and a young daughter, how his wife's brother was a cruel, violent man, much like John. Samuel had stood up to him, tried to protect his family. But the brother had influence. He had money. He turned the whole town against Samuel, painting him as a troublemaker, a threat. The law, bought and paid for, did nothing. One night, the brother and his cronies came to Samuel's home. There was a fire. When it was over, Samuel's wife and daughter were gone, and he was left with nothing but ashes and a bottomless well of grief. He never had proof it was arson, but he knew. The man who had destroyed his life, his wife's brother, was a powerful man named Jedediah Dawson. Clara stared at him, her face pale in the twilight. The name hung in the air between them. Dawson. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a curse. John wasn't just a monster in his own right. He was the heir to a legacy of evil. This wasn't just about an abusive husband anymore. This was about a family that had been poisoning this land for generations. The peace they had found was an illusion. They weren't safe. They had only poked the hornet's nest, and now the whole swarm was coming for them. As if on cue, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It wasn't John. This man was dressed in a fine suit, riding a magnificent black horse. He rode right up to the porch and dismounted. He was older than John, with cold, calculating eyes and a cruel twist to his lips. "Samuel Carter," he said, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as a razor. "I am Jedediah Dawson. I believe you have something that belongs to my son." He wasn't talking about a horse or a piece of land. He was talking about Clara. Jedediah Dawson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the small yard with a suffocating menace. "My son," he continued, his eyes flicking over Clara with cold disdain, "is an embarrassment, but he is my embarrassment, and what belongs to him belongs to me. She comes with me now." Samuel stepped in front of Clara, his body a solid shield. "She's not property, Jedediah, and she's not going anywhere with you." Jedediah almost smiled. It was a chilling sight. "Always the hero, aren't you, Samuel? It didn't work out so well for you last time, as I recall. You lost a wife, a daughter. Are you really so eager to watch another woman suffer because of your stubborn pride?" The threat was clear. It wasn't just about taking Clara back. It was a promise to reenact the darkest chapter of Samuel's life. Before Samuel could reply, Clara's voice, surprisingly strong, cut through the tension. "I will not go back." Jedediah's cold eyes settled on her. "You have no choice in the matter, girl. The law in this town answers to me. Sheriff Miller may have put my foolish son in a cell for a night to appease the mob, but he works for me. By morning, John will be free and a warrant will be issued for your arrest, for theft, for abandoning your marital duties." He was turning the law itself into a weapon against them. They were completely and utterly trapped. "You have until sunrise," Jedediah said, turning to leave. "Have her ready, or I will burn this ranch to the ground with both of you inside it, and this time, Samuel, I'll make sure there are witnesses who will swear you started the fire yourself." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than any shouting match. The sun was dipping below the horizon and the countdown had begun. They had one night to find a way out of an impossible situation. Escape was pointless. Jedediah's men would be watching every road. The law was against them. The town was against them. It was just the two of them against the devil himself. As darkness fell, a desperate, wild plan began to form in Samuel's mind. It was reckless. It was likely suicide. But it was the only chance they had. He looked at Clara, her face a mask of terror in the flickering lantern light. "There's only one way," he said, his voice grim. "We can't run, so we have to fight. We have to take the fight to him." The plan was insane. Jedediah's power came from his secrets, from the web of debt and blackmail he had woven around the town for decades. He kept records. Samuel knew this from the old days. Jedediah was meticulous. He had a ledger, a book that contained every crooked deal, every bribe, every crime he had ever orchestrated. That book was the key. If they could get their hands on it, they could destroy him. But the ledger would be in the safest place Jedediah knew, his office, in his large, heavily guarded house in the center of town. Getting to it would be impossible. "It's not impossible," Clara said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I can do it." Samuel stared at her. "Clara, no. It's too dangerous." "I used to clean his house," she explained, the words tumbling out. "Before I married John, my mother worked for the Dawsons. I know the layout. I know the secret passages the staff use. I know where he keeps the key to his office." It was a staggering revelation. A key, a piece of knowledge from her past, was now their only hope for a future. The plan shifted, becoming even more dangerous. Samuel would create a diversion, a big one, on the far side of town. He would draw Jedediah's men away from the house. While they were gone, Clara would slip in, get the ledger, and get out. As they prepared, a new, even more terrifying thought occurred to Clara. "What about the cowboy?" she whispered. "The one in the desert." Samuel's face hardened. He works for Jedediah. He'll be one of the guards." The image of his face, the vacant cruelty in his eyes, sent a chill down her spine. She would be walking into a house guarded by the very man who had assaulted her. The stakes had become impossibly high. It was no longer just about their freedom. It was about Clara facing her demon, walking back into the heart of her own trauma to save them both. Under the cover of a moonless sky, they rode towards town, their hearts pounding in unison. Samuel reached over and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I do," she replied, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "They took my life from me. Tonight, I'm taking it back." As they reached the edge of town, they separated. Samuel headed towards the stables at the south end, a bundle of oil-soaked rags in his saddlebag. Clara, her face hidden by a dark shawl, slipped into the back alleys, moving like a ghost towards the looming shadow of the Dawson mansion. Every creaking gate, every barking dog sent a jolt of terror through her. She reached the back wall of the estate, her hands finding the familiar loose stone she and the other servant children used to use to sneak out. She pulled it free, squeezed through the narrow gap, and was inside. The house was dark, except for a few lights in the windows. She could hear the low murmur of voices from the front porch, the guards. Her breath hitched. The cowboy was among them. Suddenly, a bright orange glow lit up the southern sky, followed by the faint sound of shouting. The stables. Samuel's diversion had begun. She watched as the guards on the porch cursed, grabbed their rifles, and ran towards the chaos. This was her chance. She darted across the yard, her feet silent on the manicured lawn, and slipped in through the unlocked kitchen door. The house was silent, filled with the ghosts of her past. She moved quickly, her memory guiding her through the darkened hallways. She reached the small alcove hidden behind a tapestry where a spare key to the office was kept. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. She was almost there. She reached the heavy oak door of Jedediah's office and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. She pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it gently behind her. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and cigar smoke. A single lamp was burning on the massive desk, and there it was, a thick, leather-bound ledger, sitting right in the center of the desk as if waiting for her. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. It felt heavy, heavy with the weight of decades of sin. She clutched it to her chest and turned to leave, and then her blood ran cold. A man was standing in the doorway, blocking her path. It wasn't one of the guards. It wasn't Jedediah. It was Sheriff Miller. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the sheriff said, his voice quiet. He didn't draw his gun. He just stood there, his face unreadable in the dim light. Clara froze, the ledger clutched to her chest. Was he here to stop her? Was he truly in Jedediah's pocket? "Jedediah will be back any second," Miller said. The fire at the stables was too small, too contained. He knew it was a diversion. He sent his men, but he's on his way back. Clara's mind raced. This was a trap. They had walked right into a trap. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Because my father was the sheriff when Jedediah burned Samuel's first home," Miller said, his voice laced with a lifetime of shame. "My father did nothing. He lived with that cowardice until the day he died. I will not make the same mistake." It was a stunning confession. Miller wasn't corrupt. He was trapped, a man trying to do right in a town owned by a devil. "I can't arrest him," Miller continued, his voice low and urgent. "He owns the judge. He owns the whole system. That book is the only thing that can bring him down. But not here. We need to get it to the territorial marshal in the next county." Suddenly, they heard the sound of the front door opening, followed by Jedediah's angry voice. "Search the house! Find them!" There was no time. They were trapped in the office. Miller looked around desperately, then pointed to a heavy bookshelf. "There! My father told me the old man who built this house was paranoid. There's a hidden passage behind that. They shoved the bookshelf aside, revealing a dark, narrow opening. Go, Miller urged, pushing Clara towards it. Follow it to the end. It comes out in the old cellar. Get out of town. Get that book to the marshal. What about you? Clara asked. I'm going to buy you some time, he said, pulling his pistol. He looked her in the eye. You tell Samuel Carter that Will Miller paid his family's debt. Before Clara could protest, he shoved her into the passage and pulled the bookshelf back into place. She was plunged into absolute darkness. She could hear Jedediah's footsteps just outside the office door. A moment later, she heard the door burst open, followed by shouting. Then, a single gunshot. Silence. Clara stifled a sob, her hand clamped over her mouth. She clutched the ledger and began to run, stumbling through the suffocating blackness of the hidden passage, the sound of the gunshot echoing in her ears. She was their only hope now. Clara stumbled out of the passage into the damp, musty cellar. The gunshot still echoed in her mind, a sickening punctuation mark to Sheriff Miller's sacrifice. She had to keep moving. She found the cellar's outer door, its wooden slats warped and swollen with damp, and forced it open with her shoulder. She scrambled out into the night, the cool air a shock after the stale darkness of the passage. The shouting from the front of the house seemed distant now. She had a head start. But where was Samuel? Had he escaped the diversion? Or was he already captured? She couldn't think about that. She had to focus. Get the book to the marshal. That was the mission. She ran through the back alleys, her lungs burning, the heavy ledger banging against her ribs. She was heading for the livery stable at the north end of town, praying that Samuel had had the foresight to leave a horse for her. As she rounded a corner, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was the cowboy, the one from the desert. He stood there, silent, his face a blank canvas. This was it. It was over. She had failed. She clutched the ledger to her chest, bracing for the end. But he didn't move towards her. He just stood there, watching her. Then he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He's waiting for you, at the old church. He jerked his head to the east. Take my horse, it's faster. He pointed to a dark shape tied to a nearby post. Clara stared at him, utterly bewildered. Why? She managed to whisper. Miller was a good man, the cowboy said, and that was all the explanation he offered. He turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving Clara standing in the alley with a get-out-of-jail-free card she could not comprehend. She didn't waste time questioning it. She ran to the horse, a strong-looking bay, untied the reins, and hauled herself into the saddle. She kicked its sides and galloped out of town, leaving the lights and the danger behind her. She found Samuel at the ruined shell of the old mission church on the edge of town, just as the cowboy had said. He was pacing anxiously, his face etched with worry. When he saw her, a wave of relief washed over him. Clara, I thought... Miller is dead, she said, the words tasting like ash. He bought me time. She held up the ledger. But I have it. They looked at each other, the grim reality of their victory settling in. They had the weapon, but they had lost a crucial ally. And Jedediah Dawson, now a murderer, would be more relentless than ever. He would hunt them to the ends of the earth to get that book back. They rode hard through the night, pushing the horses, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the town that had become their personal hell. As the first light of dawn broke, they stopped to rest the animals. Samuel took the ledger from her, his hands running over the worn leather. 20 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For 20 years, he's gotten away with everything. It all ends now. But as he opened the book, his face went slack. His eyes scanned the pages, first with confusion, then with dawning horror. No, he whispered. No, it can't be. Clara looked at him, her heart sinking. What is it? Samuel looked up at her, his face ashen. "It's a fake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The first 20 pages are records of grain sales and land deeds. The rest of the pages are blank." The world tilted on its axis. The sacrifice, the chase, the hope, it was all for nothing. It had all been a trap, a brilliant, sadistic trap. Jedediah had known they were coming for the ledger. He had left a decoy for them to find, sacrificing his own sheriff in the process, just to lead them on this wild goose chase. And now they were out in the open, with nothing but a worthless book, and Jedediah's real power was completely untouched. They hadn't won. They had lost in the most complete and devastating way possible. And somewhere behind them, Jedediah and his men were closing in. For a long moment, they just stood there in the gray morning light, the scale of their failure crushing them. Every sacrifice had been for nothing. Sheriff Miller had died for a book of blank pages. The cowboys' mysterious act of help was a pointless gesture. They were fugitives with no proof, no allies, and the most powerful man in the county hunting them down with murder in his heart. The despair was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that threatened to suffocate them. Samuel dropped the useless ledger in the dust. "He played us," he said, his voice hollow. "He played all of us." But then, a flicker of something ignited in Clara's eyes. A memory. Back in the office, when she was grabbing the ledger, her hand had brushed against a small locked box on the desk. At the time, she'd ignored it, focused only on the book. But now... "There was something else," she said, her voice urgent. "A box. A small iron box on his desk. He was so arrogant he left the ledger out in the open. What if the real records, well, what if they're in that box?" It was a sliver of a hope. A wild, desperate gamble. But it was all they had left. Samuel looked at her, then at the road back towards the town they had just escaped. Going back was suicide. Jedediah would have the entire town locked down, every road watched. "We can't go back," Samuel said. "We don't have to," Clara replied, her mind racing. "The territorial marshal, he was Miller's plan. It's still our plan. We don't have proof now, but we have a story. We are witnesses to a murder committed by Jedediah Dawson. It's our word against his, but it's enough to get the marshal to listen. It's enough to get him to go back to that town and get a warrant to open that box." It was a long shot. They would be asking a federal lawman to take the word of 2 fugitives against a wealthy, influential landowner. But Clara was right. It was their only move, their last move. They turned their horses and rode east, towards the territorial capital. A 2-day ride if they pushed themselves and the horses to the limit. The chase was on. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Behind them, Jedediah Dawson would have discovered their escape. He would not be sending a small posse. He would be sending an army. Every bounty hunter, every hired gun, every man who owed him a favor would be on their trail. The stakes had been raised to their absolute peak. It wasn't about a ledger anymore. It was a race for their lives, a race to see if they could reach the law before Jedediah's brutal form of justice reached them first. They rode for a day and a night, stopping only for a few precious hours to let the horses rest. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. On the second day, as they crested a high ridge, they saw it, a dust cloud on the horizon behind them. A big one. It was Jedediah's posse. They were closing the distance, and they were closing it fast. Samuel and Clara spurred their horses, their hearts hammering. The animals were exhausted, their sides heaving. They wouldn't last much longer. Ahead of them lay a narrow canyon, a rocky, treacherous path that would be difficult for a large group to navigate. It was a risk, but it was their only chance to slow the posse down. They plunged into the canyon, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed eerily. They were halfway through when the first gunshot cracked through the air, and a chip of rock exploded from the wall next to Clara's head. They were trapped. Riders appeared at both ends of the canyon, sealing them in. Jedediah Dawson sat on his black horse at the entrance, a cruel smile on his face. "It's over, Samuel," he called out, his voice echoing off the rocks. "There's nowhere left to run. Give me the girl and I might let you live." "Not a chance, Jedediah," Samuel yelled back, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. He and Clara took cover behind a large boulder. They had one rifle, one pistol, and a handful of bullets. Against them were at least 20 men. The odds were impossible. The posse began to advance, using the rocks for cover, their rifles barking. Bullets whizzed past their heads, ricocheting with angry whines. Samuel returned fire, his shots measured and precise. He was a good marksman, but he couldn't hold them off forever. This was it. The last stand. They were going to die here, in this dusty, forgotten canyon. Suddenly, a new sound joined the cacophony of gunfire, a bugle call, clear and sharp. Both Samuel and the posse froze, looking around in confusion. Then, on the ridge above the canyon, a line of blue-uniformed soldiers appeared. The cavalry. At their head was a man with a handlebar mustache and a determined glint in his eye. "Jedediah Dawson," he yelled, his voice booming across the canyon. "You are under arrest for the murder of Sheriff William Miller by order of the United States Territorial Marshal's Office." Jedediah stared up at them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. For a moment, it looked like he might order his men to fight. But his hired guns, seeing the cavalry's repeating rifles aimed down at them, started to lower their own weapons. The fight was over. As the soldiers came down to disarm the posse, the cowboy from the desert emerged from the cavalry's ranks. He walked over to Samuel and Clara. "Sheriff Miller was a cautious man," he explained. "Before he went to the Dawson house, he sent a telegraph to the marshal, told him if he wasn't heard from by sunrise, to assume the worst and come looking. Looks like his message got through." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Miller's death hadn't been a futile sacrifice. It had been his final, brilliant move, a checkmate from beyond the grave. Weeks later, the dust had settled. With the testimony of Samuel, Clara, and the cowboy, who turned out to be an undercover marshal's deputy, and with the contents of the iron box from his office, Jedediah Dawson's empire of corruption came crashing down. The town was finally free. The ranch was quiet again, but this time, it was a real peace. A lasting one. Clara and Samuel stood on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the hills in the same shades of orange and pink it had on that first morning. They weren't broken anymore. They were survivors. They had faced down the devil and won. Their story wasn't one of easy love or simple heroism. It was about two people who had been pushed into the dust, who had every reason to give up, but who chose to stand and fight back anyway. It was a story about finding the courage to face the monsters, both outside and in, and choosing to believe that even in the darkest night, the dawn will eventually come. The world is full of bullies and tyrants, big and small. What this story really shows is that it only takes one or two good people willing to risk it all to stand up and say, "No more." It's a reminder that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but about how much you can endure and still keep moving forward. If you were touched by the courage of Clara and Samuel, do us a favor and hit that like button. And make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there are a million stories out here in the wild and you won't want to miss the next one we have to tell. Thanks for listening.